At just 9 months old, Annie Jones was leased to P.T. Barnum by her own parents. The circus machine immediately branded the baby as an animalistic attraction to sell tickets. Raised in corporate isolation, she generated massive fortunes while suffering severe psychological trauma. She spent her final years desperately fighting to ban the word freak from the industry, only to die of tuberculosis at 37. This is the cold, factual reality behind Barnum's most exploited bearded child. Human gestation is governed by a strict, highly regulated biological sequence. During the later stages of fetal development, the human body is typically covered in lanugo, a fine, unpigmented layer of downy hair designed to regulate temperature within the womb. Under standard biological conditions, this hair is naturally shed prior to birth, replaced by the finer, virtually invisible vellus hair that covers most of the human body. However, in July 1865, in the economically devastated landscape of Marion, Virginia, this fundamental biological sequence catastrophically misfired. Annie Jones was born with a severe and exceedingly rare genetic mutation known clinically as hypertrichosis. Instead of shedding the fetal lanugo, the hair follicles across her entire body became hyperactive. The fine down mutated into thick, dark, aggressively proliferating hair. When the infant was delivered, she presented an image that entirely shattered the conventional parameters of human infancy. Gone was the smooth, vulnerable skin expected of a newborn, replaced entirely by heavy swathes of dark hair, with dense growth completely obscuring her cheeks, her forehead, and her limbs. Before she had taken a single breath of air outside the womb, she already possessed the distinct, undeniable markers of a full adult beard. In the economically devastated landscape of post-war Virginia, a child born with a severe physical divergence was traditionally viewed as an insurmountable liability. 19th century medical science offered zero genetic explanations and absolutely no palliative treatments. Society at large viewed physical anomalies through a lens of profound hostility, attributing them to divine punishment or latent bestial curses. The initial reaction of her parents, John and Annie, was reportedly one of profound horror. They were confronted with a biological absolute that they could not understand and could not hide. Yet, within the harsh utilitarian framework of extreme poverty, parental horror possesses a remarkably short half-life. The initial shock rapidly and permanently mutated into a cold, calculating realization of immense commercial value. The Jones parents looked at the infant, resting in her crib, and recognized that they held a monopoly on a highly exportable commodity. Bypassing any instinct to shield their daughter from society's unforgiving scrutiny or to seek medical mitigation, they instead identified a highly lucrative loophole in the American economy. They understood that the booming entertainment industry, heavily reliant on the exploitation of human physical anomalies, would pay an absolute premium for a bearded infant. The concept of parental duty was fundamentally rewritten. The child was no longer a daughter requiring protection and nurturing. She was a unique, unparalleled money-making opportunity. The parents actively decided to package the infant for the market. When Annie was exactly 9 months old, long before she was capable of forming a coherent syllable, walking unassisted, or comprehending her own reflection, her parents removed her from the quiet obscurity of rural Virginia. They transported her directly to the chaotic, heavily monetized epicenter of the American freak show, Phineas Taylor Barnum's American Museum in New York City. Far removed from any genuine consultation regarding the child's welfare, the meeting within the museum walls functioned strictly as a clinical, industrial appraisal of a human soul. Phineas Taylor Barnum, a man whose entire corporate empire was built upon the aggressive, unapologetic commodification of physical divergence, examined the 9-month-old girl. Ignoring her health, cognitive development, or psychological vulnerability, Barnum strictly evaluated the density of her facial hair and the sheer visceral shock value her biology would inflict upon a paying audience. Barnum recognized instantly that a bearded baby was a marketing monolith, a walking visual paradox that would drive thousands of Victorian citizens to purchase admission tickets out of sheer morbid curiosity. Barnum immediately drafted and presented a formal, legally binding contract to Annie's parents. He offered to lease the biological rights to the infant for a guaranteed period of 3 years. The financial compensation attached to this contract was staggering. Barnum agreed to pay the parents a weekly salary of $150. For a working-class family in the ruined landscape of post-war America, $150 a week was not just a salary, it was generational wealth, a sum so absolute that it instantly extinguished any lingering parental instinct to protect their child from the public gaze. The parents signed the document. This contract demands a relentless, unforgiving ethical interrogation. Operating far beyond the parameters of a mere employment agreement, this binding contract executed the formalized legal liquidation of a human being's fundamental right to a standard, private existence. In the mid-19th century, the legal framework regarding children was brutal and absolute. Children were legally classified as the strict property of their parents, devoid of any independent legal agency, human rights, or institutional protection against commercial exploitation. There were no child labor laws to prevent an infant from being placed on an exhibition platform. The parents utilized this absolute legal ownership to permanently convert their daughter's genetic mutation into a massive, continuous cash flow. They sold her right to privacy. They sold her right to an unobserved childhood. They sold the fundamental sanctity of her physical form. For $150 a week, they granted a ruthless entertainment corporation the absolute authority to dictate how the world would perceive, interact with, and consume their daughter. The transaction established a terrifying, highly efficient mechanism of destruction. The basic human right to self-determination was completely bypassed. Before Annie Jones even possessed the cognitive capacity to understand what a contract was, her entire life trajectory had been locked into a legal document. She was officially classified as corporate inventory. The moment the ink dried on the Barnum contract, the parents secured their financial empire. But the psychological and social destruction of Annie Jones was officially mechanized. The entertainment machine took physical and legal possession of the 9-month-old asset. The men sitting in the corporate offices of the American Museum immediately initiated a massive, calculated public relations campaign designed to entirely erase her inherent humanity. They prepared to replace the vulnerable infant from Virginia with a highly profitable, carefully engineered label, a brand that would trap her in a psychological cage, dictate her every movement, and define her entirely by her follicular mutation for the rest of her natural life. The immediate, urgent operational directive for Phineas Taylor Barnum's marketing syndicate, upon securing the lease for the 9-month-old Annie Jones, was the total systemic eradication of her human identity. The name Annie Jones was fundamentally counterproductive to the economics of the freak show. It was a terrestrial civilian name. It evoked the image of a standard vulnerable human infant, which would inevitably trigger the protective, empathetic instincts of the Victorian public. Empathy is the absolute enemy of the exhibition industry. An audience that pities a subject will not repeatedly purchase tickets to stare at them. To maximize revenue, the child had to be violently severed from her humanity and repackaged as an otherworldly specimen. Barnum achieved this through a highly calculated, deeply cynical manipulation of religious iconography. He permanently stripped the infant of her given name and officially branded her the infant Esau. This specific nomenclature was not a random theatrical choice. It was a devastatingly effective weapon of cognitive manipulation. In the Abrahamic religious tradition, Esau was the elder twin brother of Jacob, famously described in the book of Genesis as being born red all over like a hairy garment. By attaching this specific biblical label to a 9-month-old girl, Barnum executed a brilliant sociopathic marketing maneuver. He provided his deeply religious 19th century audience with a theological justification for their morbid curiosity. When the crowds flooded into the American Museum, they were no longer paying to gawk at a sick, genetically mutated female infant from Virginia. They were paying to witness a living, breathing manifestation of biblical scripture. Barnum successfully transformed a pediatric medical anomaly into a spiritual curiosity. This branding created an impenetrable psychological barrier. It actively instructed the public to view the child not as a human being requiring medical intervention or basic dignity, but as a mythological artifact, a divine oddity placed on earth specifically for their visual consumption. The label Infant Esau acted as a cognitive anesthetic, entirely numbing the moral outrage that should have accompanied the public exhibition of a bearded baby. The absolute terrifying success of this objectification was violently demonstrated before Annie even reached her early childhood, when a human being is legally contracted, marketed, and publicly consumed entirely as an object. Society inevitably begins to treat them as an inanimate commodity. They cease to be a person and become a high-value asset, highly susceptible to theft. During one of her early exhibitions in New York, the infant Esau was kidnapped. A strict, unvarnished analysis of the perpetrator's underlying motives immediately exposes the sheer, terrifying depravity of this specific abduction. Bypassing the standard profiles of a desperate, grieving parent or a traditional criminal seeking a cash ransom, the perpetrator who orchestrated this targeted abduction was actually a local New York phrenologist. Phrenology was a highly popular, deeply racist pseudoscience of the 19th century that claimed to determine a person's intelligence, morality, and evolutionary status by measuring the physical contours and bumps of the human skull. This phrenologist did not look at Annie Jones and see a frightened toddler crying for her mother. He looked at her hyperactive follicular mutation and saw an unprecedented, highly lucrative biological specimen. He abducted the child with the explicit, singular intention of establishing his own private exhibition. He intended to monopolize the revenue stream generated by her face and to utilize her physical anomaly to legitimize his fraudulent scientific theories regarding human evolution and genetic regression. The ensuing legal and physical recovery of the child brutally exposed her true status within the American legal and economic framework. When the authorities finally tracked down the phrenologist and retrieved Annie, the event was not framed as the heartwarming rescue of a traumatized toddler. It was handled both legally and culturally as the successful recovery of stolen corporate property. The phrenologist had not merely committed a crime against a child, he had committed industrial espionage. He had stolen Barnum's highest-grossing inventory. When the authorities finally recovered Annie, the ensuing court proceedings brutally exposed the uncompromising reality of her existence. Elliot Jones fought desperately on the witness stand to prove her maternity and reclaim her abducted daughter from the phrenologist. However, the justice system handled the high-profile case less like a traumatic child abduction and more like the retrieval of stolen high-value inventory. The mother successfully won her child back, but the horrific reality of their poverty dictated the next step. There was no safe civilian sanctuary waiting for Annie. The moment the traumatized toddler was returned to her parents' arms, the $150 weekly contract resumed. The rescued child was immediately handed right back to the exact same exhibition industry that had made her a lucrative target in the first place. Following the recovery, Barnum's corporate grip on the child tightened into an absolute stranglehold. The environment in which Annie Jones was subsequently raised was a sterile, heavily monitored ecosystem designed entirely to protect the investment and maintain the illusion of the infant Esau. She did not experience a standard developmental childhood. She was raised within the chaotic sensory assault of the American Museum, and later within the rattling claustrophobic confines of the circus train cars. Her early neurobiology was entirely shaped by the demands of the exhibition. She did not possess standard childhood peers. Her social network was strictly confined to ticket takers, sideshow barkers, and the massive, faceless crowds that stared at her from beyond the velvet ropes. The industry required her to appear wildly anomalous to justify the premium admission prices. Therefore, any standard educational or socializing influences that might humanize her to the public were actively suppressed during her formative years. The corporate machine needed the public to believe she was a creature, a missing link, or a biblical throwback. Teaching the infant Esau to read, to speak with refined diction, or to exhibit standard polite Victorian behavior would actively shatter the brand identity Barnum had so meticulously constructed. She was kept in a state of manufactured, highly profitable isolation. Her physical environment was physically safe, fiercely guarded by the parents who relied on her for their wealth and the managers who relied on her for their box office. But it was a completely sterile vacuum of human dignity. The developmental milestones of her early life were not measured by her first steps or her first words, but by the increasing length of her facial hair and the corresponding spikes in ticket sales. The tragedy of her early years is defined by the absolute seamless efficiency with which the adult world conspired to delete her humanity. From the rural parents who signed the initial lease, to the corporate executives who branded her a biblical monster, to the pseudoscience practitioner who stole her like a piece of laboratory equipment, every single adult who interacted with Annie Jones looked at her entirely through the lens of extreme capitalism. She was a living, breathing human child trapped inside a biological anomaly, forced to grow up in a literal glass cage where her only legally recognized function was to generate revenue through her own silent, highly visible humiliation. As Annie Jones transitioned from the heavily guarded confines of a legally leased childhood into chronological adulthood, the fundamental nature of her psychological imprisonment shifted. The physical anomaly that defined her, the aggressive, unyielding hypertrichosis, did not wane. Her facial hair grew into a thick, cascading beard stretching several inches down her chest. She was no longer the infant Esau. She was officially marketed as the premier bearded lady of the American and European exhibition circuits. However, beneath the dense follicular growth and the relentless, aggressive marketing campaigns of Phineas Taylor Barnum's empire, a profound and deeply tragic biological paradox was developing. The industry required a beast, but Annie Jones had developed the intellect and the refinement of a highly sophisticated Victorian aristocrat. The sheer cognitive dissonance of her daily existence is agonizing to strictly analyze. Annie was not a feral creature, nor did she possess any cognitive deficits. On the contrary, she was highly intelligent, deeply observant, and remarkably gifted. Having spent her entire life touring the major cultural capitals of the world, from New York to London to Paris, she absorbed the high culture that her managers actively tried to hide from her public persona. She taught herself to be fluent in multiple languages. She possessed an impeccable, highly refined grasp of Victorian etiquette. She was a deeply talented musician, mastering the mandolin and frequently playing complex classical arrangements. Yet this profound intellectual and artistic development was actively suppressed and weaponized against her by the very industry that controlled her. The Victorian public did not pay premium admission prices to witness a dignified, multilingual woman play the mandolin. They paid to be shocked, disgusted, and morbidly fascinated by a genetic aberration. Therefore, the corporate handlers deliberately framed her sophistication as a grotesque, comedic juxtaposition. When she was permitted to speak or play her instrument on stage, it was not presented as a genuine display of human talent. It was presented as a bizarre parlor trick. The promoters essentially told the audience, "Look at the beast, mimicking high society." Her immaculate manners and her beautiful musical performances were utilized solely to heighten the freakishness of her beard. She was forced to participate in the daily systematic degradation of her own intellect. The psychological toll of possessing a brilliant, refined mind while being universally perceived, marketed, and consumed as a subhuman anomaly is a specific, suffocating form of torture. She was the smartest person in the room, contractually obligated to let towering strangers treat her like an exotic animal. The physical exhibition within the canvas tents of the Barnum Empire represented only the primary localized vector of Annie Jones's commercial exploitation. As she entered adolescence in the 1870s and 1880s, the rapid industrialization of a new technology, commercial studio photography, unlocked a massive, highly unregulated secondary revenue stream. The advent of the carte de visite and the cabinet card transformed localized sideshow attractions into globally distributed, mass-manufactured visual commodities. The entertainment syndicate immediately recognized that while they could only sell one ticket to a spectator inside the museum, they could sell millions of physical photographs to the global public. Annie was legally required to sit for rigorous, highly orchestrated sessions with prominent Bowery photographers, most notably Charles Eisenman, a man who built a lucrative empire exclusively capturing sideshow performers. These sessions were not exercises in portraiture. They were clinical, corporate branding exercises. The photographers deliberately staged Annie in hyper-feminine, deeply conservative Victorian postures. She was dressed in elaborate, tailored silk gowns, adorned with delicate pearl necklaces, and posed holding standard domestic props like woven baskets or floral bouquets. This specific visual architecture was engineered to create a jarring, highly marketable psychological contrast with the thick, dark, masculine beard covering her face. Hundreds of thousands of these stiff cardboard photographs were printed and sold for pennies across the United States and Europe. Annie Jones was transformed into a piece of pocket-size tradable inventory. The corporate machine successfully divorced her physical image from her biological body, generating continuous passive income while entirely stripping her of the copyright to her own face. Her genetic mutation went viral in the 19th century postal system, hanging in the private parlors of strangers across the globe who consumed her image as a domestic novelty. However, this massive photographic economy generated a unique corporate liability: consumer skepticism. The Victorian public, highly aware of theatrical hoaxes and glued-on prosthetics, frequently suspected that the bearded lady was simply a male performer dressed in women's clothing. To ensure this skepticism did not collapse the lucrative cabinet card market, the entertainment syndicate required absolute clinical verification of her gender and her anomaly. They did not rely on public relations statements. They actively weaponized the American medical establishment to audit their product. Annie Jones was routinely subjected to highly invasive, degrading anatomical examinations by prominent board-certified Victorian physicians. These doctors were not providing palliative medical care or seeking a cure for hypertrichosis. They were functioning strictly as corporate auditors. They were paid to clinically inspect her genitalia and her hair follicles to definitively rule out physical fraud. Following these humiliating physical intrusions, the physicians issued formal, written certificates of authenticity, legally confirming her female anatomy and verifying that the follicular growth was a genuine biological reality. These medical certificates were then aggressively utilized in Barnum's marketing materials and were frequently printed directly onto the reverse side of her cabinet cards. This practice represents a terrifying, absolute suspension of bodily autonomy. Her physical anatomy was legally open to the clinical scrutiny of strange men simply to guarantee the authenticity of a 25-cent photograph. The medical profession, bound by oaths of patient care, entirely abandoned its ethical parameters to participate in a corporate verification scheme, proving that the system would eagerly violate the most intimate, fundamental boundaries of a woman's body to protect the profit margins of the freak show. The astronomical retail value generated by Annie Jones inevitably spawned a massive, unregulated black market within the 19th century entertainment sector. Rival sideshow syndicates, desperate to capture a fraction of Phineas Taylor Barnum's revenue stream, began mass-producing fraudulent, bearded ladies. These competitors utilized cheap theatrical crepe hair, attached with spirit gum, or simply employed cross-dressing male performers, flooding the regional circuits with counterfeit biology. This proliferation of fake anomalies presented a severe existential financial threat to Barnum's market share, threatening to dilute the premium value of his primary asset. The public's growing awareness of these theatrical hoaxes risked collapsing the entire economic foundation of the hypertrichosis exhibition. Barnum did not respond to this market infringement with standard defensive advertising. He executed a ruthless, highly litigious strategy of absolute biological monopolization. He leveraged the invasive medical audits Annie had already endured to construct an impenetrable corporate fortress around her genetic mutation. Barnum publicly issued massive, heavily publicized financial bounties, frequently offering thousands of dollars in cash, an amount capable of bankrupting smaller rival circuses, to any medical professional, journalist, or competing promoter who could physically prove that Annie Jones's facial hair was fraudulent. This financial bounty was not a demonstration of corporate faith in Annie. It was a highly predatory economic weapon deliberately engineered to crush independent competitors. Barnum utilized Annie as the absolute medically verified gold standard of the bearded lady aesthetic. By publicly attaching a massive financial wager to her authenticity, he effectively forced rival promoters to submit their own performers to the same humiliating clinical medical inspections. Knowing the counterfeit performers would immediately fail these audits and face public financial ruin, the rival circuses were forced to retreat. Barnum had successfully executed a ruthless market maneuver. He monopolized a human genetic condition. Annie Jones was deployed as a commercial weapon, utilizing her verified medical status to actively destroy the livelihoods of rival performers. The entertainment syndicate proved that within the freak show economy, a biological malfunction was not treated as a medical tragedy. It was a highly guarded asset, fiercely defended against any unauthorized market infringement. This absolute, unyielding isolation extended into the most intimate, vulnerable spheres of human existence. For a woman permanently branded as a sideshow attraction, the standard terrestrial avenues of romantic love and civilian companionship were completely eradicated. Annie could not attend a standard social gathering, a church service, or a public dance without inciting a riot of pointing fingers, cruel whispers, or outright panic. She was permanently walled off from the standard population. Consequently, her entire social and romantic reality was geographically and psychologically confined to the closed, incestuous ecosystem of the traveling circus. In 1880, at the age of 15, Annie Jones married. To the outside observer, a marriage might represent a brief flash of normalcy, a desperate grasp at standard adult autonomy. A clinical examination of the union reveals a much darker, highly transactional reality. The man she married was Richard Elliot. He was not a civilian outsider offering her an escape route from the sideshow. Richard Elliot was a barker for Barnum's circus. The role of the barker is crucial to understanding the predatory nature of this relationship. A barker is the man who stands on the raised platform outside the exhibition tent, utilizing aggressive, hyperbolic language to verbally reel in the passing crowds. He is the vocal instrument of the exploitation. The man explicitly paid to dehumanize the performers and reduce them to sensational catchphrases. Richard Elliot was a fully grown adult man. Annie was a 15-year-old girl whose entire concept of reality had been warped by institutionalization. Rather than serving as a genuine romantic liberation, this specific marriage operated strictly as an internal corporate merger, allowing Richard Elliot to seamlessly integrate himself directly into her massive, continuous revenue stream instead of rescuing her from the circus. By marrying the star attraction, the man who previously earned a meager wage shouting her name suddenly gained legal and financial leverage over her life. In the 19th century, marital laws granted husbands overwhelming control over their wives' assets. Elliot transitioned from being her vocal promoter to being her legal custodian, ensuring that his financial survival remained inextricably tethered to her follicular mutation. This transactional dynamic proved inescapable. Annie and Richard Elliot divorced after 15 years of marriage. Shortly after, Annie entered into a second marriage. The identity of her second husband, William Donovan, perfectly illustrates the absolute terrifying effectiveness of her social imprisonment. William Donovan was also a circus press agent and a barker. Annie Jones never managed to breach the perimeter of her exploitation. Her emotional and romantic life was strictly confined to the very men whose professional careers were built upon advertising her deformity. She was surrounded by men who looked at her face and saw a box office receipt. The concept of unconditional civilian love, a love entirely divorced from ticket sales and exhibition schedules, was a luxury the industry ensured she would never experience. Her marriages were merely extensions of her employment contract, proving that even in her most private moments, she remained entirely trapped within the architecture of the freak show. The corporate containment of Annie Jones extended far beyond the physical canvas of the circus tent and penetrated directly into the patriarchal legal architecture of the 19th century American courtroom. When 15-year-old Annie married Richard Elliot, the circus barker, the transaction was not merely a psychological manipulation. It was a devastating financial acquisition governed by the strict legal doctrine of coverture. Under this prevailing statutory framework, a woman's independent legal personhood was instantly suspended upon marriage, and all her generated wealth, property, and future earnings were entirely transferred to the absolute legal control of her husband. By marrying the highest grossing biological asset in the Barnum syndicate, Elliot effectively executed a legal hijacking of a massive continuous corporate revenue stream. He was no longer a salaried employee shouting through a megaphone. He became the legal proprietor of the bearded lady's income. For 15 years, the staggering capital generated by her daily physical humiliation was legally diverted directly into the bank accounts of the man explicitly employed to advertise her deformity. She was legally reduced to an indentured revenue generator within her own marriage. However, as Annie matured into a highly intelligent, financially literate adult, she initiated a staggering, unprecedented legal rebellion against this specific economic subjugation. In 1895, she formally initiated a grueling, highly publicized divorce proceeding against Elliot. In the rigid, deeply conservative judicial system of the late Victorian era, a standard civilian woman initiating a divorce to reclaim her financial autonomy was inherently scandalous. For a legally classified sideshow freak to utilize the state courts to aggressively assert her economic independence was a massive, unprecedented, systemic shock. Annie successfully weaponized her indispensable status within the entertainment syndicate to fund elite legal representation, ultimately securing the formal dissolution of the marriage. Stripped of any romantic sentiment, this aggressive legal maneuver functioned entirely as a ruthless, highly calculated corporate, hostile takeover of her own existence and financial autonomy. By legally severing the coverture bond, she forcefully reclaimed the absolute intellectual and financial rights to her own biological output. This precise, aggressive legal maneuver is the unvarnished mechanical reason she was subsequently able to independently acquire massive real estate holdings in Manhattan. She utilized the exact same American legal system that had permitted her parents to lease her as an infant to officially and legally terminate the parasitic financial control of her first husband, proving her absolute mastery of the commercial mechanics that governed her existence. As she entered her late 20s and 30s, Annie achieved a level of financial autonomy that was virtually unprecedented for a woman in the late 19th century. Barnum's enterprise generated astronomical wealth, and as the undisputed star attraction, Annie commanded a massive continuous salary. She utilized her sharp intellect to navigate the financial world, taking her circus earnings and investing heavily in the booming real estate market of New York City. She became a wealthy, highly successful property owner. She possessed enough capital to buy absolute comfort, luxury, and physical security. However, her massive financial portfolio brutally exposed the ultimate paradox of her existence. Wealth without social dignity is simply a gilded cage. Annie could purchase a massive brownstone in Manhattan, but she could not walk out of its front D. Or to purchase a loaf of bread without triggering a mob. She could afford the finest tailored silk dresses from Paris, but the moment she put one on, the public only saw the beard resting against the fabric. Her money could buy her prime real estate, but it could not buy her the fundamental human right of anonymity. The financial extraction of Annie Jones was not strictly confined to the domestic American economy. It was aggressively expanded into a massive, highly lucrative, multinational export operation. During the 1880s and 90s, the entertainment syndicate recognized that the European market possessed an insatiable, highly capitalized appetite for American biological anomalies. Annie Jones was consequently deployed as the primary high-value asset in a heavily orchestrated geopolitical touring strategy, crossing the Atlantic not as a civilian traveler, but as a premium, heavily insured corporate export. The absolute staggering hypocrisy of this international deployment peaked when her corporate handlers secured private, highly exclusive exhibitions within the highest echelons of European aristocracy, including formal documented presentations to the German Kaiser and Tsar Alexander III of the Russian Empire. A rigorous clinical analysis of these royal encounters permanently destroys any romanticized illusion of high society acceptance or upward mobility. Stripped of any diplomatic respect for her intellect or fluency in their native languages, the European monarch summoned her strictly as a bespoke luxury biological import. The corporate executives meticulously choreographed these royal interactions, dressing her in the most expensive tailored Parisian haute couture and adorning her in heavy jewels. This was a deliberate sociopathic styling choice, explicitly engineered to maximize the grotesque visual contrast between elite, aristocratic refinement and her severe follicular mutation. To the emperors and kings of Europe, she was essentially an exotic temporary court jester, a living, breathing manifestation of crude American sensationalism, imported for their private amusement. She was treated with the exact same detached zoological fascination reserved for a rare bird in a royal menagerie. However, for the American entertainment syndicate, these humiliating royal audiences function as the ultimate unprecedented corporate sponsorships. The exact moment the Tsar of Russia or the German Kaiser laid eyes upon the bearded lady, the executives immediately weaponized that royal interaction in their international marketing campaigns. They utilized the royal seal of approval to exponentially inflate admission prices across the entire European continent, transforming a private aristocratic viewing into a massive public marketing engine. The physical body of a woman who was legally denied the fundamental right to unobserved, civilian anonymity in her own homeland was effectively utilized as a high-level geopolitical chess piece. She was seamlessly deployed across international borders, navigating the most exclusive palaces on earth, serving no other function than to extract millions of dollars in foreign currency for the corporate overseers who controlled her contracts. The psychological endurance of a human being subjected to lifelong absolute objectification eventually reaches a critical threshold. As Annie Jones entered her late 30s, the profound cognitive dissonance of her existence, being a wealthy, highly educated, multilingual property owner who was simultaneously exhibited as a subhuman beast, culminated in an unprecedented act of rebellion. She did not attempt to breach the physical perimeter of the circus. She recognized that her physical anomaly made terrestrial anonymity impossible. Instead, she launched a highly calculated, aggressive strike against the foundational architecture of her exploitation, the language utilized to define her. During a highly publicized European tour with the Barnum and Bailey Circus in the late 1890s, Annie Jones mobilized her fellow performers. She utilized her undeniable leverage as the undisputed highest-grossing star attraction of the exhibition to organize the giants, the little people, the conjoined twins, and the individuals possessing severe skeletal anomalies. She initiated what was, effectively, an early, unacknowledged civil rights and labor movement within the most exploitative industry on earth. Her central non-negotiable demand to the management executives and the international press was the absolute abolition of the word freak. The profound historical weight of this specific demand becomes glaringly apparent when analyzing the devastating lexical and legal power that word commanded throughout the 19th century. Freak was not merely a derogatory insult. It was a corporate classification. It legally and culturally categorized a human being as a biological mistake, a piece of living trash entirely devoid of standard human dignity, psychological boundaries, or civil rights. By legally defining their employees as freaks, the entertainment industry absolved itself of any moral obligation to treat them as human beings. Annie Jones demanded that the industry replace the word freak with the term prodigy. This proposed linguistic shift was a brilliant, desperate attempt to reclaim her biological and legal personhood. A prodigy is an individual possessing exceptional, almost miraculous qualities. It implies an inherent, profound human value. It commands respect rather than disgust. By demanding the title of prodigy, Annie was explicitly rejecting the narrative that she was a cursed, bestial infant Esau. She was forcing the towering, average-sized world to acknowledge that the individuals on the exhibition platforms were highly capable, intellectually functioning human beings who possessed rare physical divergences, not monsters spawned from the dark corners of the earth. She was fighting a desperate war for the right to self-definition, attempting to overwrite the contract her parents had signed 36 years earlier. The corporate response was a demonstration of cold, unyielding institutional resistance. The management executives recognized that adopting the term prodigy would fundamentally destroy their business model. The public did not pay premium admission prices to respectfully observe human prodigies. They paid to be terrified and disgusted by freaks. To grant the performers human dignity was to actively sabotage the box office revenue. The press occasionally patronized her campaign, publishing her demands as a quaint, amusing anecdote. But the massive billion-dollar machinery of the exhibition industry refused to surrender its most profitable, dehumanizing label. Annie's lexical rebellion was ultimately crushed under the immense financial weight of the status quo. The physical toll of this lifelong psychological war, combined with the grueling, relentless logistics of decades of international touring, severely compromised her biological immune system. In the early years of the 20th century, Annie Jones contracted tuberculosis. At the time, tuberculosis was an aggressive, incurable respiratory pathogen. The disease systematically invaded her lungs, creating necrotic cavities within the pulmonary tissue. The dark, poetic tragedy of her physical decline is devastating. The very respiratory system she had utilized to sing, to master multiple languages, and to articulate her desperate demand for human dignity was being slowly, violently destroyed. Yet, as her body rapidly emaciated and her lung capacity collapsed, the hyperactive follicular mutation remained entirely unaffected. The heavy dark beard continued to grow, a thriving biological anomaly attached to a dying, exhausted woman. In October 1902, recognizing that her physical failure was imminent, Annie Jones was forced to cease touring. She required a place to die. Despite her massive PIP, personal wealth, and her extensive real estate portfolio in Manhattan, she did not die in her own luxurious brownstone. The profound, inescapable tragedy of institutionalization is that the victim often has no terrestrial anchor outside of their exploitation. Annie retreated to the only familial connection she possessed. She traveled to Brooklyn, New York, to the home of her biological mother. Annie Jones died of tuberculosis on October 22nd, 1902. She was 37 years old. The location of her death forces a brutal, unforgiving reconciliation of her entire existence. She took her final agonizing breaths in the presence of the exact same woman who had signed the Barnum contract 36 years earlier. The mother who had looked at her 9-month-old infant, calculated her market value, and leased her humanity to a corporation for $150 a week, was the final witness to the conclusion of that transaction. Annie Jones had spent her entire 37 years on Earth traveling the globe, generating massive fortunes for executives, barkers, and her own family. Yet she never truly possessed a home. Her fundamental identity had been sold before she had the cognitive ability to claim it, and she died in the arms of the very architect of her lifelong captivity. The historical autopsy of Annie Jones demands a radical, highly uncomfortable reevaluation of how society consumes human suffering and physical divergence. Her life was a flawless, 37-year demonstration of the absolute destruction of a human soul by the mechanics of extreme capitalism. The entertainment industry identified a pediatric medical anomaly, stripped the child of her given name, branded her a biblical monster, isolated her from civilian society, weaponized her own intellect against her, and fought aggressively to ensure she would die classified as a freak rather than a human being. This specific architecture of exploitation did not die with Annie Jones in 1902, nor was it buried when the massive canvas tents of the traveling circuses finally collapsed in the late 20th century. The overarching philosophy of the machine, the cold, utilitarian monetization of human divergence and the stripping of pediatric privacy for public consumption, has simply migrated to a vastly more efficient, highly decentralized platform. We currently inhabit a digital ecosystem that actively replicates the exact economic parameters of the Barnum contract. The modern freak show does not require a physical stage or a barker with a megaphone. It operates through algorithmic distribution and the relentless monetization of the intimate domestic sphere. When modern parents utilize social media platforms to aggressively broadcast the severe medical conditions, the neurodivergent breakdowns, or the physical anomalies of their own children, they are executing the exact same biological transaction that Eliot and John Jones executed in 1866. They are signing digital terms of service, converting their children's inherent vulnerabilities into highly profitable metrics: subscriber counts, ad revenue, and corporate sponsorships. They are bypassing the child's fundamental right to an unobserved private developmental period, feeding the child's medical reality to a global audience of billions in exchange for direct financial compensation. The audience that eagerly consumes this content, clicking on thumbnails displaying a child's medical trauma or physical divergence, is entirely indistinguishable from the Victorian crowds that paid a quarter to stare at the bearded lady. Society has successfully sanitized the mechanism of delivery, replacing the sawdust arena with the glowing screen of a smartphone. But the core biological transaction remains identically ruthless. The ultimate resonant warning of Annie Jones's life is that the exploitation of human dignity is never a relic of the past. It is a continuously evolving, highly adaptive industry. Her legacy forces us to confront the brutal reality that whenever a society allows parents or corporations to price the privacy and the biological reality of a child, and whenever an audience willingly consumes that child's divergence as daily entertainment, the cage is rebuilt. The bearded infant from Virginia stands as a permanent, haunting testament to the fact that unless a culture actively defends the fundamental right to human privacy, the machine will always find a way to sell the soul.